Welcome to another episode of the Genocide Recap Show, a show that tells the stories of history's past genocides. Let's get to it, shall we? In this episode, I'll be going through the Rwandan Genocide of 1994. In order to talk about this genocide, we first need to go back a bit to what led up to this horrible event. Now, there are two major ethnic groups in Rwanda, the Tutsi and the Hutu. The Hutu came into Rwanda in the 11th century, then the Tutsi came along in the 14th century. But after mass amounts of Tutsis started to immigrate to Rwanda, the Tutsis became the ethnic majority, and in the 16th century, the Tutsi created a kingdom in the central region of Rwanda and also creating their monarchy. Now we move to the colonial phase. In 1898, Germany colonized Rwanda and put forth a policy of rule that strengthened the Tutsi and the absolutism of its monarchy. This continued under the rule of Belgium when they took control after World War I. Some Hutu began to demand equality. They found sympathy from some Belgian administrative personnel, and then this led to what's known as the Hutu Revolution. The Hutu Revolution began with an uprising on November 1st, 1959, when a rumor of the death of a Hutu leader at the hands of a Tutsi perpetrator was out. This led groups of Hutu to launch attacks on the Tutsi. Many months of violence followed this, and many Tutsi were killed, and many had to flee the country. On January 28, 1961, a Hutu coup, which was carried out with the tactical approval of Belgian colonial authorities, officially forced the Tutsi king to leave the country and destroying the Tutsi monarchy. Rwanda became a republic and an all-Hutu provisional national government began. Independence was proclaimed the next year. During this Hutu revolution, around 20,000 Tutsi were killed, and many more fled the country, and 3 years later, about 150,000 Tutsi were in neighboring countries. Many more killings of Tutsi came about in 1963, 1967, and in 1973. The tension between the two tribes sparked again in the 90s, when the Tutsi-led Front Patriotic Rwandians, aka the FPR rebels, invaded from Uganda. A ceasefire was established though in early 1991. Negotiations between the FPR and the Hutu president were being made in the next couple years, and in 1993, the FPR and the Hutu government called for the creation of a broad-based transition government that would include the FPR. Hutu extremists were strongly against the plan. They used a lot of newspapers and radio stations to propagate their anti-Tutsi message. Now we move to the official 100-day genocide in Rwanda. It started on April 6, 1994, when a plane carrying Hutu President Habyarimana was shot down, and everyone on the plane died. Hutu and FPR blamed one another immediately for what happened. This led to organized killings of Tutsi and moderate Hutu people led by Hutu extremists. The Prime Minister, Agathe Uwilingiyimana, was assassinated the next day along with 10 Belgian soldiers who were part of the UN peacekeeping force who were keeping her guard. The assassination was part of a campaign to eliminate moderate Hutu and Tutsi politicians and creating a Hutu extremist-only run government, led by a man named Theoneste Bagosora, who was later identified as one of the head organizers of the genocide. After the killings of the politicians, the Hutu had control of the political grounds and had established their government in Rwanda on April 9, 1994. The new president was a man named Theodore Sindikubwabo, who was the Speaker of the National Development Council, Rwanda's legislative body at the time. Now the Hutu militia groups led the way for mass killings and propaganda through radio to try to convince people to join them and to kill their Tutsi neighbors, who were called cockroaches, who needed to be exterminated. It was estimated that over 200,000 Hutu participated in the genocide, although some were forced to join. Machetes were commonly used for the murders. Rape was also a weapon, as well as the deliberate use of perpetrators infected with HIV/AIDS to carry out assaults, intentionally making a lot of Tutsi women infected. Now let's get to the UN and their role. The UN already had troops in Rwanda for peacekeeping purposes. As the UN couldn't control a ceasefire on April 21st, the crisis deepened and the UN voted to pull the amount of troops they had from 2,500 to 270. This led to the UN being unable to control the situation as it got worse. On May 17th, the UN then reversed their plans to then voting to establish a 5,500 soldiered force, mainly coming from African countries. But even then, the troops could not be deployed immediately. The UN was then able to deploy a French-led military force to establish a safe zone. The operation was then opposed by the FPR because they claimed that France had always supported the government and policies of the Hutu presidency. countries such as the US and Britain had several meetings discussing plans but could not all come up with one agreed solution. The Tutsi had rejected the legitimacy of the extremist Hutu government. The FPR kept fighting back. The FPR invaded the outskirts of Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, in April and were able to secure most of the country by early July. On July 4th, they were able to get the extremist Hutu leaders to flee the country. A transitional unified government was then established on July 19th, with Pastor Bizimungu, a Hutu man, as president, and FPR leader Paul Kagame, a Tutsi, as vice president, finally putting a close to the Rwandan genocide. In the end of it all, over 800,000 lives were lost, and over 2 million people fled the country. That concludes this episode of Genocide Recap. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Ivan Derekshani, signing off.